You're listening to the Place Northwest podcast, your digital resource for the latest insight and analysis on all things property in the northwest of England.
Welcome to the latest instalment of the Place Northwest podcast. I'm your host, Dan Whelan. Today's episode, brought to you in association with engineering design, energy and sustainability consultancy Hydrock, will explore how the development industry is responding to changes in our shopping habits. Retail is in decline, which represents opportunities for developers and landlords. Today, we will discuss what these opportunities are and how we can unlock them. Joining me to discuss the new and innovative ways to reinvigorate the high street and boost landlords' revenues are two experts. Chris Bowie-Hill, Director of Innovation Delivery at Hydrock, and Chris Lloyd, Investment Director at Glenbrook. My first question, Chris of Hydrock, who I'm going to call Chris for the duration of the podcast. Chris Lloyd, you will be Chris Lloyd. Your job title intrigues me, Chris. The Director of Innovation Delivery. Can you tell me a little bit about what it is you do in the context of today's discussion, which is all about the changing face of retail?
Of course, yeah. And thanks, Dan, for having me on the show. So I think from our perspective, of course, we've been watching the high street struggle along for some time. And then a pandemic came along and that really didn't help things. You know, e-commerce was a significant nail in the coffin. We've seen a number of skills within the built environment, be it architecture or, kind of community and so forth, really have a go at how they can reinvigorate the high street. And, with varying degrees of success. But what we wanted to do is bring our engineering approach to really start to look at the things that we get involved with on a day-to-day basis and start to say, well, how does that in a changing world start to provide opportunity? So, Dan, do you want me to jump into some of those ideas now, or is that something we're going to get into in a moment?
Yeah, we'll get into that very shortly because there's lots of the sort of new and innovative ideas that people probably haven't thought about yet, but we will get to those in a moment. Chris Lloyd, Chris just said there about the changing face of the high street, and obviously Glenbrook has been involved in that in various locations. Stockport springs to mind, with the development of stock. Can you tell us a little bit about how you view the landscape at the moment in terms of the changing face of retail and the opportunities it presents companies like Glenbrook?
Well, I think you answered the question in the question there, Dan. We are looking for real estate assets that we can enhance, add value to, and ultimately create a profit for our investors. So, without wanting to sound too crude about it, what's happening with the high street at the moment is manna from heaven. In that there's lots of uncertainty and lots of opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember actually speaking to you, Chris Lloyd, at the start of the pandemic over the phone, and you said exactly that. It presents massive opportunities, and you seized one in Stockport Town Centre project that's just completed. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that before we get into the sort of the minutiae of what other opportunities there are? Tell us a bit about stock.
Yeah, so stock is very simply the repurposing of a former department store. We bought the building from Marks and Spencer's in October 2019 and drew up plans to convert it into predominantly an office building. The large floor plates of the building just lent themselves to an office, to a call centre. This is what we thought at the time, to a call centre, contact centre, services centre. And then the pandemic hit and we sort of scratch our heads about what we're going to do with it. Is there going to be an office market post-pandemic? All the rest of it. But in the end, we concluded that there will be. It's situated right in the middle of South Manchester. South Manchester is a very well-established office market. And yeah, we just cracked on. And we've just finished it. We launched it last month. It looks brilliant. We dropped a light well right through the middle of it. And not my words, Dan, but the words of a number of office agents who are not retained on the building said it's the coolest building they've ever seen outside of Manchester city centre.
Wow, high praise indeed. Congratulations on that. Chris, office development in a department store, we're seeing that a lot of local authorities are doing the same. They've bought these shopping centres and they're repurposing them into offices, sometimes for their own staff. We're seeing it in Oldham, Bury as well have bought a shopping centre. You name it, they've bought it. Tell us a little bit though about what the opportunities are beyond offices. What's your research and your work uncovered in terms of the opportunities to boost the revenues of the landlords that own these assets?
Yeah, I think department stores are in a really interesting space, like across the board. I mean, they were developed typically in the high street. They were kind of the anchor store of the high street, and the store element has gone now, but they're still anchor buildings. They are a really key component of our high streets. And I guess from a commercial perspective, so often you see these being bought up and turned into wholesale residential. And I guess from a commercial perspective, I'm not a developer, but I can see it from a commercial perspective. I'm sure it makes perfect sense. Challenge, I would say, around, say, for instance, residential. I know Chris Lloyd has referred to more about office, call center, and so forth. Kind of come to that in a moment. Challenge around residential is I kind of see them quite often as fortress-like. Unless you've got the key card, unless you've got the fob or the code to get in, you're very much not welcome. And so what we're doing is we're taking an anchor building on a high street and excluding the high street. We're excluding the community around it. So I think there's some challenges there. I'm not saying they can't be overcome, but I think what we need to do is we need to look at how we're approaching that and come up with some ways of actually making the space much more inclusive from a community perspective, because I think that's what's going to bring social value. And it's social value that will make sure that the high street continues in the direction it needs to. I think from an office perspective, it's kind of driving employment. That's good from a social value perspective. I guess, the bit that Chris referred to earlier in terms of developing the coolest buildings. Let's face it, I'm an engineer. I'm not going to help you make your building look cool. You've got plenty of architects to do that for you. The bit that I refer to is the rest of the building. So from an engineering perspective, we get involved in things like power and data. And these are kind of like under the hood components of our working world. So in terms of the office space, not every square foot of that building, of that former M&S, are you going to be able to convert into high quality office space. Some of it's going to be pretty dark, back of house, dingy space, and that's cool. So what we're doing is we're kind of looking at that and thinking, well, what's the opportunity there to create these almost like infrastructure nodes? We still need goods in, goods out, and that almost starts to lean towards last mile logistics. Data's it's gathering pace, and data's been huge for so long. I get that, but so many of the data centers have moved out to Siberia, where it's a long way away, but you keep it cool. Whereas we're thinking, actually, there's an opportunity to bring a lot of those high-powered data centers much closer to home, and this is going to be required for things like once we bring autonomous vehicles online, there's all this IoT, Internet of Things data that's going to be bouncing around, and Siberia's too far. There's a latency there that causes a problem. I don't know, from dark kitchens, Deliveroo, Uber Eats, to vertical farms, there's a whole host of stuff which is our under the hood infrastructure world, and we can facilitate that through power, data, and highways.
And are you saying that you could incorporate some of those things in the dark and dingy spaces of a building like stock?
I believe we could, yeah. I mean,
okay.
Chris Lloyd and I will have to get together and have a look at the plans that are there, and maybe that's a boat that sailed. But as I say, I don't think every square foot of that building could be grade A office space. If we start to look at the challenges that we face moving forwards around a lot of the obvious stuff like changing weather patterns and farming becoming so challenging, and so much of our food, I think it's something like 2/3 of our green leafy veg is brought in from Almeria in the south of Spain. Food miles are huge. But imagine if you could create in those dark back of house spaces, you could be growing all your leafy greens for the whole high street, for the local community. And it's like a giant vending machine. And you go in along to your supermarket, and it's the leafy greens are grown in the back. I mean, and then they can use the power that's available overnight. We've got a huge challenge on the network whereby on a windy, sunny day, we've got too much power. When those PV panels are kicking out loads of power, when those wind turbines are really spinning, we've actually got too much power. But then overnight, again, it's just a huge challenge. Why don't we find a sink for that energy? Let's grow some plants in that back of house space.
It's really interesting. And Chris Lloyd, I'd love to get your sort of opinion on what Chris has been saying there about it. It sounds like the approach is squeezing every last bit of potential out of the space available. Had you considered growing leafy greens in the dark spaces in stock? I know the agents already think it's pretty cool. That might make it maybe even a bit cooler. What are your thoughts?
It's we are obviously open to monetizing every inch of the building. That's an obvious statement, and the question's always going to come back to the viability of doing that. Now, I ain't a farmer, but I would imagine that to make it work, to sort of monetize it properly, you need some serious scale, don't you, Chris?
I'm being a little bit provocative in what I'm suggesting. I mean, we did have a look at a feasibility for a European centre for excellence around modern methods of agriculture. That's quite a mouthful, but the idea was to take a department store and at ground floor level start to create like a science and industry space where people could start to understand where our food comes from. This idea of seed to plate, which I know Eden Project are a huge backer of, for people to understand where this food comes from, the supply chain, and how it ends up on your plate. So almost like science and industry. So that's about education. Then above that, you start to create some incubator space. So that would be for, all of the bright ideas, the universities, the academics coming together. And then above that, some office space. So we're driving commercial rents at kind of first and second. Then a showcase to actually have this vertical farm, like a vertical farming installation and a showcase to it. So you could go and have a look at it and it's actually producing food and so forth. And the idea, as I said earlier, is it's kind of like a social value piece about taking that anchor building and actually starting to say, how can we in the long term start to help support our high street? And then I think I've just kind of skipped at the top. We said then put another 2 stories of floor space above that, which would then, residential, allow you to drive some commercial value again. There's how you would make it work. There are many, many challenges to it. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to look down the line and say, what challenges do we face? Food miles, carbon, agriculture, all of this sort of stuff, and start to say, well, okay, look, if that's kind of utopia and that's at one end, can we kind of work our way back to where we are now? Last mile logistics is a very real thing. Battery storage. I mentioned about how we have too much power at the wrong time. If you give me a spare store cupboard, I'll fill it with batteries. We'll charge it when the energy is cheap and we'll sell it back to the grid when energy is expensive. And I'll make you some money out of that. And that's really simple stuff and that can be done. Vertical farming, it basically, one of the challenges we've got is it does work at scale. The rents are challenging in city centres. You give me a cupboard that's worth nothing, then I can probably make some money out of it. But if the group of us here on this call said, right, let's go and set up a vertical farm, and we put some job ads out for vertical farmers, we're not going to get many replies. There's a huge skills shortage there.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Chris Lloyd, did you sort of, aside from the office space, maybe tell us a little bit more about what Stock offers, both in terms of the facilities in the building, but also what it offers Stockport in its regeneration journey?
Well, one of the big things it offers is the opportunity for people to work in a relatively high skilled job in the town centre. And then those, it's 60,000 square foot. So in theory, you can have 600 very well-paid people working around Stockport in the morning, lunchtime, and early evening. So it should have a benefit, an immediate benefit to the town centre. It also offers Stockport other than a really cool building, a sustainable building as well, because by definition, we've repurposed an existing building. So we've not had to dig into the ground. We've not had to get a load of steel. We've not had to have loads of diggers driving around Stockport, sorting out a site. We've not had to close any roads. It's a sustainable location because it's in the town centre. We are installing solar panels across the roof, and we've got a big old roof. It must be, the gross floor area must be 25,000 square foot or something like that. So it's a big roof. But again, it unfortunately it only sort of, it's probably only going to give enough power to provide electricity for the common areas. and unlike, which will have a financial benefit to the occupiers because the service charge will be lower than most buildings. Well, it's lower than a lot of buildings. What I think needs to happen, and this I'm batting it straight back to the sort of the innovators and to science, is that the solar cells need to be better.
Before we move on, because we've been talking about the high street, I want us to move out of town shortly and discuss the opportunities there. But I just wanted to come back to a couple of the uses, Chris, that you mentioned that could potentially increase the value of an asset for a landlord in terms of the revenue it generates. So dark kitchens. So I think we all know what dark kitchens are, but how easy is that to implement, and how profitable would that be in terms of how quickly would that make a return for the landlord?
So this process of kind of identifying which opportunities are kind of most lucrative, again, it depends where we're talking. If we're talking high street, if we're talking out of town, really what you're looking for is decent transport infrastructure, and that's obviously for the bikes to get in and out, and then you're looking for proximity to residential, because of course without people you're not really going to sell many burgers, are you? Okay. So when we start to look at the parameters surrounding this, we say, right, okay, technical viability on a dark kitchen. To be honest, if you've got a space, you can normally put some fans in there to ventilate it and get the lights and the power. Technical viability is pretty straightforward. If you've got some empty retail space on an out-of-town retail park, and you're fighting some pretty strong retail headwinds, staring down. If you say the R word too many times, you can talk yourself into it, can't you? But if consumer behavior changes and there is less spending in out-of-town retail parks, we have an additional headwind against the e-commerce angle, which was just the decline of traditional retail. So you've got this space and you're thinking, well, I haven't let it. What am I going to do with it? Is it close to a highway? Well, these out-of-town retail parks, they generally are. They tend to be, from an infrastructure perspective, pretty well connected. And they tend to be reasonably close to some residential as well. It makes perfect sense. So I'm not an agent. I couldn't tell you exactly what the going rates are for a dark kitchen. But what I do know is technically it's very feasible. And It's better than having nothing in there.
Yeah, absolutely. A very impressive dance around the word recession there as well.
So you said it.
I've said it. I'll say it. The elephant in the room. So dark kitchens we've covered there, but it seems that, and Chris Lloyd, you mentioned this before, that the issue of scale. If you're working within an old M&S unit in a town centre, or you're working in an out-of-town retail park with, big box retail units, it would seem that there might be more scope for these opportunities that you're talking about, Chris, in the out-of-town market. Would that be fair?
Yeah, just because the square footage is bigger, isn't it? And that provides scale. So immediately, we have a retail park in near Stoke-on-Trent, and that's 60,000 square foot. Just from memory, that's 3 times the size of stock. So you'll be able to produce, in theory, 3 times as much electricity, 3 times as many mushrooms, 3 times as many lettuces, 3 times as many whatever, just because you've got a floor in. Then you also have a large car park, haven't you? And you can put in your EV charging points, which we are doing where we can, and you can. There's all sorts of things. If you own it long enough, there's also the battery storage bit. Lots of back in the day, lots of occupiers used to have the USP units at the back of the units, the uninterrupted, the little petrol-driven, diesel-driven backup supply. Now, I suspect in time those will sort of morph into battery storage units, and the solar from the roof goes into that. Everything goes down. You draw onto that. There's all sorts of things all sorts of things connected. Could be all connected up, but they perhaps need a better brain than the average property developer really to make that happen. And like yourself, Chris, will be invaluable to developers going forward.
Yeah, well, this is it. We're in the process of setting up some microgrids toolkits, and they're exactly this. As I mentioned earlier, you've kind of got your landlord areas, you've got your tenant areas, which are directly connected to the grid. And actually, by connecting directly to the grid, what you're doing is you're missing this opportunity to share and exchange and trade power within your building. And then what you're only doing is you're only ever importing the gap that you can't meet, and then you only ever export a very, very small surplus. And just from a commercial perspective, it just becomes very, very efficient.
Chris, Lloyd, Glenbrook acquired a few out-of-town retail assets sort of either just before the pandemic or during the pandemic. I'm not sure if the one in Stoke you mentioned was one of them, but what was your plan? What was your plan when you went into those investments, and how has that changed given what's happened over the last 2 years?
It's a very good question. Did we have a plan during the pandemic other than thinking this was just very good value on a cost per square foot basis? We bought them from long-term investors and institutions who, because they had the R word, not recession, but retail in front of it, just thought, we need to get rid of this, and sold it at very competitive prices. But since then, it's proven itself to be a very robust asset class, second really only to build to rent and logistics in terms of institutional interest. So did we have a grand plan? We just thought it was very competitively priced, and if all the occupiers went bust as a consequence of COVID, we just took, we rather than let them to, I don't know, Pound Stretcher or occupiers like that, we'd be letting them to Hermes and Amazon for mini distribution units, because they are, as Chris mentioned before, just very, very well located near chimney pots, near main roads. It's easy in, easy out, isn't it? That's why they remain so popular, because it's just dead easy to go. It's easy to go to Curry's, go and buy, electrical charger or whatever, come back out, and you're away in 10 minutes, aren't you? Whereas the high street struggles a little bit sometimes, because that's not an easy experience, isn't it? You go into the high street for a reason, and that I think that's evidenced by the fact there's a lot more leisure now in high streets. But there's a positive from that, is that there's a lot longer dwell time. Whereas retail warehousing is a sort of one hit. You sort of go in, go to B&M, get your car and go home, don't you? So
Yeah.
there's I still believe there's still scope for both retail asset classes. It's just one hasn't started the recovery yet, but I think it will.
Right. Very interesting. And you mentioned there about the, potentially letting units if they became available to the likes of Hermes or Every, I think they're called now, and Amazon. And that lends itself much more, doesn't it, as Chris Lloyd was saying, to the out of town parks rather than the high street, which is a bit more constrained logistically. Are we starting to see that in big box retail parks? Are we starting to see the likes of Hermes take space there, and are they recognising the opportunities?
Do you know what? I don't know. I do not know of a single letting on a retail warehousing park to a last mile distribution. I just don't know of any. There must be somewhere, but I don't actually know of one. So all this rhetoric about it's perfect for them, and they have live these last mile distributing tenants. They've got live requirements all over the country, but I've never seen one. Probably because there isn't the space for them. And the existing occupiers have soaked up the space mostly.
That's interesting. Chris, do you have any thoughts on that? It seems ready-made and perfect for those sorts of occupiers, but we're not really seeing it happen at the moment, are we?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think probably what it poses the question, why? Why not? And I think often we kind of stumble across these things and we think, well, that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? But just no one's done it. So nothing happens about it. And I think this is where we've approached our asset optimization tool again, is around looking at these retail parks, these out of town retail parks, and thinking, as you say, Chris Lloyd, they, in the world of retail, they've definitely stood on their own feet compared to high street. But when we got thinking about this, we were working with, an institutional investor that had seen the same opportunity as you, Chris, and thought, pre-pandemic, right, loads of these out-of-town retail parks, they're going really cheap. And we think they've basically underpriced them because everyone's frightened by the retail word. So we'll buy them and we'll figure something to do with them. probably what they were thinking mostly was, well, the spaces that aren't let, the void spaces, we'll just work a bit harder. We'll just work a bit harder and we'll get someone in there. We'll add some value and we'll flip it on in 7 years and that's it, job done. Anyway, we kind of got chatting to them and said, look, there's probably some additional stuff you can do here. Well, we had a chat with a couple of agents and they said one of the trends they were starting to see was that, if we take the Currys, for instance, it was turning into less of a kind of a full shop where you had showroom in the front and storage in the back. A lot of the storage was being held off site. So actually what was happening, people were coming to see like the larger white goods and various sofas, whatever it might be. They would come to front of house, they'd have a browse, have a look, place an order at the till, and then that would be delivered to them at home. Now what you've got 3,000 square foot at the back of the unit, which again is this kind of dark space. It's this dead space that no one really wants. So now we're starting to think, what could we shoehorn into that? So then we start to look at all of these options and we think, right, we're coming at this from an approach as a bunch of engineers. We're thinking, we want some EV charging points. I mean, that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? We like those because it brings people that maybe wouldn't have come to the park in, and now they've got to wait half an hour, 2 hours, whatever it might be, while the car charges. So we've got some additional footfall and some additional dwell time. And then we think, well, what about this overnight situation? How do we start to use those charging points? Well, a lot of the fleet vehicles now, they're struggling to find places to charge them because they've got so many of these electric fleet vehicles. They can't do them all at HQ because, again, the grid is constrained. They're trying to put new power supplies in. But actually, the power sits at the out-of-town retail park. So as engineers, we're assessing it and saying, well, what's the headroom? How much capacity have we got there? We'll get a lease in place and we'll charge these electric vehicles. So we'll rent them, say, from 10 in the evening. So they get dropped there, they charge. They'll be gone by 8 in the morning. And you've got another income stream. And now we're into the back of the units and we're saying, well, okay, let's start with batteries. And then what about last mile logistics? It's kind of where we started this conversation. And then what about these edge data centers? As more and more autonomous vehicles come online, honestly, there's going to be so much data bouncing around the network. And it's got to happen. Bang, 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 bang. It's got to be quick. It's got to be low latency. We can't send it out to Siberia and wait for the traffic to come back. It's got to happen now. And then we go into cold chain logistics. You just keep going. MRI scanners. I mean, they're brilliant. Again, you talk about footfall and dwell time. You want someone to come to your park that wouldn't naturally have come to your park. Well, actually, maybe an elderly grandparent has got to have a hip scan or whatever it might be. And actually, mum, dad, and the 2 kids come along and kind of drop the grandparent there, and they're going to wait around for an hour, 2 hours. What are they going to do? Maybe there's a food and beverage offering. Maybe it's footfall and dwell time. It's looking at all of these alternative use types and starting to stitch this together in a modern environment. Retail is being challenged. The world is evolving. The world is changing. Let's see what the opportunity is right here, right now, and let's make some additional revenue out of it.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely fascinating, and I suppose in short, your message to these pension funds and asset managers that own these out of town retail parks is, work with us to let us open your eyes to the opportunities, because it seems at the moment that it's maybe kind of a one-dimensional kind of thinking, and not in any kind of negative way, but maybe these options that you're talking about, people just haven't considered them because they haven't thought of them. I'm conscious of time, so I just wanted to finish off with one last question, if I may. We've talked a lot about retail, obviously, and that is sort of the part of real estate that is most ripe for these kind of interventions, I think. But Chris, well, both of you actually, but Chris, Hydrock, Chris, if you could tell us, have you thought any further into what maybe the other opportunity areas are going forward away from retail in terms of delivering some of these interventions?
Yeah, well, retail is where we started. That was because the opportunity we had and the institutional investor we were working with. But even they've acknowledged themselves that really this is what we call asset optimization. It's a process. It's a process of looking where there's any spare space, be it externally or internally, looking at trends, alternative trends that others haven't really picked up on. And I think this is where, as engineers, we're kind of coming at it from a bit of a unique standpoint and starting to see how can we create these more resilient offers. If we are going to go into a recession, and during economic boom times, there's loads of money sloshing about, and that's really good for retail, or it's good for loads of different industries. But actually, when all of those purses tighten up, you want some resilience. You want something that's counter-cyclical in terms of infrastructure. It's going to get more expensive. Electricity is going to get more expensive, but if you can be generating revenue from power, people, there's going to be money in that. People are still going to use power. And data, people are still going to use data. And actually, as those purse strings squeeze, people will probably still shop, but it'll probably be driven even more to e-commerce. So last mile logistics becomes more important. People are still going to want to eat fish fingers and frozen food. So cold chain logistics is still a thing. People still need their hip scanning or whatever it might be. So MRI scanners, scanning centers. It's just about looking at these trends, looking forwards. And then, we have too much space in the wrong use types. And I think if we start to reallocate that, repurpose it, think about how it can be reused, I think there's huge amounts of additional revenue streams for people to realize.
Yeah, and Chris, Lloyd, what are your main takeaways from today? How much of this is practicable, and how much of it is, kind of that would be nice, but
I think as I sit here today, I think all the things that Chris has been spoken about, he's come with some great ideas, some of which we were aware of, some of which we weren't, and they're all on a wish list. We wish we could do all these things. And I think today, quite a few of the things have moved from the wish list onto the to-do list. That's how I would sort of summarise that.
Okay.
And I anticipate anyone else listening to this will probably do the same thing. And I'm just sort of sat in the Glenbrook office here, looking out the window, and there's two huge Grade A office buildings in front of me, the Lincoln and 125 Deansgate, and that just says to me, there's a lot of floor area there, there's a lot of roof space there. How is that being used? So, in terms of what other assets you could look at, for power generation, as we talk about, and other uses, I think city centre offices, business park offices, they tend to have large floor plates. And also, our build to rent buildings as well. They are big. They are big pieces of real estate, very big.
Absolutely brilliant. Well, we're already talking about this, the broadening the scope of where these things could be implemented. So, absolutely fantastic to speak to you both. We have run out of time, but I really appreciate you both taking the time to be on the podcast. This episode was brought to you in association with Hydrock. For more information about Hydrock and its services, visit www.hydrock.com. And thank you so much for listening. We hope you can join us next time for the next episode of the Place Northwest podcast. Thank you very much.